all these friends I had who came to my house to play suddenly didn't come in. Their parents were afraid that if they were associated with somebody who was Jewish, they would get into trouble. They went to the store, they tore down the shutters, they opened the doors, they went into the store and they ransacked the store. The next morning, an open truck came into the village and collected all of the Jewish men. When the truck was full, they went to the railroad station, they put the men on trains, and they sent them to Dachau. Dachau was the first concentration camp that Hitler had ever built. He built it as soon as he became chancellor, and it was designed to house prisoners who were somehow in Hitler's eyes, anti-Hitler. When you think about the Holocaust, just off the top of your heads, what's the first word that comes to your mind? Just say it out loud. You don't have to raise your hand. Just atrocity. What else? Global? Okay, horrible. Yep. What's that? Hitler? Okay. Any other nouns? Okay. Okay. Interesting that nobody said concentration camps, which is what usually comes up first. And I think when we think about the Holocaust, that's the period of the final solution, when Hitler decided that the only way to solve the Jewish problem, as he saw it, was to get rid of all of them, kill them all. And so that's often the focus of what we think about when we think about the Holocaust. And when we think about the Second World War, it's really dominated by that. But I think that for us to really understand the Holocaust and to really understand how Hitler was able to carry that out, we need to backtrack a little bit and think about why it happened in Germany and how Hitler managed to get the German population to go along with this. If we're getting a little bit of the sense of how it's possible by seeing what's happening in Ukraine now, how one really determined leader can devastate an entire country or an entire population. But it was a little bit different in Germany. And I think if we want to really to be able to understand that and to be able to follow through on our slogan, Never Again, which was one of the things that came out of our recognizing what had happened, we need to really look at how this came about and why it happened in Germany. And I don't have time to go into the details, but it has a lot to do with a large part of the German population feeling left out, feeling unappreciated, underrepresented. They saw that a large segment of the population was doing well, but that they were being left behind. And so they were ready to follow a leader who promised them a better life and a better country. And that also probably resonates with a lot of the things that we've been hearing in various sources in our contemporary world. And they picked on the Jews because the Jews had been discriminated against in Germany since even before the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages. So this was a common scapegoat, and it was easy for them to pick on the Jews. And those are just some of the very quick, superficial reasons. One of the other things that really helped Hitler was that he was very canny about how he went about his program. He did not rush into it. He did it slowly and very gradually. And he himself has said that he would only push things as far as he can succeed. That if it gets too difficult, he'll pull back and he'll restructure and make it so that the next time he tries, he will be overwhelmingly successful. And so when he began his program in Germany against Jews, he did it very gradually. And I think what I want to share with you today, my own family story will illustrate that extremely well. So let's begin with my family story. I hope I can manage this okay. Um, my family had moved to Germany from France back in the middle of the 18th century, about the time that the British colonies in North America were doing pretty well. And they moved to a very small corner of southwestern Germany, where France and Switzerland and Germany all met. And they moved into this little town named Kensingen, which was founded in 1249, a little bit older than Lexington. My my great grandfather, this is an overview of the village. You could see it was a farming village, and it was sort of almost as if it were a walled village. Everyone lived in the middle of it, and then the fields were all around. And my family lived on the main commercial thoroughfare in this little village. My great grandfather bought a house there. It's the one on the left. And he decided that he would open a dry goods store there, a store that sold household items and fabrics, so that the villagers would be able to provide for their everyday needs without going elsewhere. There was no such store in the village at the time. And so he did very well. That building is still standing, and you can see what it looks like now. There's still a store on the first floor. The family lived on the second and third floors of that building. So he did very well, and his son, my grandfather, eventually inherited the store, and he married a young woman who was blonde and blue-eyed. That signified what in Hitler's Germany? Anybody know what blonde and blue-eyed meant? Yeah. Okay. The Aryan race, right? These were the pure Germans, so very desirable. My grandmother was not Aryan; she was Jewish, from a long line of distinguished Jews. But she moved into this little village, and together they built up the store, and they had 4 sons. Can you see these slides? All right, it seems they're a little washed out looking. The one on the left is my father, and those were his brothers. Now, these boys were among the very few Jewish children in the village. It was such a small village; there were only about 3 Jewish families in it. So their friends were all non-Jews. Mostly, the village was a Catholic village, although there were some Protestants living in it. But he went through school with mostly non-Jewish friends. And unlike most of the kids in the village, these 4 boys all went through high school. Most of the young kids had to leave school after 6th grade so that they could work on the farms. But they went through high school, and they did very well. And they were incredibly active in school. They in extracurricular activities. They were in the theater group. They were in the glee club. Of course, they were in the soccer team. And they were just generally considered part of the population. There was no discrimination. When the First World War broke out, the 2 older boys decided that they were old enough to be able to enlist in the army because they wanted to help defend their fatherland. So they really thought of themselves as Germans, and that this was their home. And so they enlisted. They were both in the quartermaster corps, so they weren't on the front lines, and as a result, they both survived the war. After the war, the 3 boys, other than my father, they were young men at that point, they decided that this village, Kensington, was really a pretty boring place, and they would have little economic opportunity or educational opportunities. So they all decided to move to cities, and they moved to various cities around Germany to try to get more education and to build a career. But my father agreed that he would stay in the village and inherit the store. In order to do that, he also believed that he needed to get better training so that he would really learn how to run a store and to plug into more modern techniques that my grandfather had been using. So he went to a nearby city, the city of Freiburg, So it's a very well-known city even today. It has a large and respected university, especially a medical school, and it has a very beautiful cathedral. So it's always been the center of a good deal of attraction. My father went there and apprenticed himself to a large wholesale business, and he learned how to run a store. While he was in Freiburg, he met my mother. My mother was the girl in the middle. She was the oldest of three cousins, all of whom were only children and all of whom were girls. They were very close with each other. They grew up in a very comfortable middle class family. My mother and one of her cousins learned how to play the piano very well together, so they played a lot of music with four hands. And they went through high school. My mother trained to be an office manager, learned shorthand, bookkeeping. Um, she also took a lot of courses at the university. She had a very active social life, lots of boyfriends, went to dances and plays. So she had a very rather sophisticated and a very happy life. But when she met my father, it really was love at first sight, and she agreed that she would move to the village to be with him. It must have been an enormous change for her. I was born a year after they were married in 1931, and I was the only grandchild in both sets of grandparents. So I was well on my way to being spoiled. This was a very, very happy time for my family. I was doing well. I was about two in this picture. My father had bought a car, and he was really, this was so special because nobody else in this village had a car yet. This was the very first car that anyone ever had, but he used it to take merchandise from the store and to go out to those farms around the village to sell merchandise to the farmers directly, so they wouldn't have to come into the village and take time out to do that. And they were really happy to have this kind of front door delivery service. And he became very popular in a very large area. People knew him for quite a few miles around. And so the business was thriving, and the marriage was thriving, and this young couple were very popular in the village. People loved to hear my mother play the piano. People told me we were welcome to drop into the other houses at any time. They would always be happy to see us, and it was just a very comfortable lifestyle. And for special occasions, my parents would go into the city to be with my mother's family, and they would be able to go to the opera or to the theater and to go to dances. So they had a sort of the best of both worlds. And I was very much integrated into the village. I participated even as you can see, as a 2-year-old, as a 3-year-old in village life. I was dressed up for Mardi Gras. I had a sled and friends. People loved to come, kids loved to come to my house to play. Not so much because they thought I was so great, but I had good toys. And I had a real kitchen, and I had a rocking horse that was really a rocking horse where they had only broomsticks with rags tied at the end. So that this was a great time, and we were very popular in the village. Well, all of that changed in 1933 as soon as Hitler came to power. The first thing that my father noticed in this little village where he had been so popular was that he was told he could no longer be a member of the soccer team. So here's a soccer team. He had been a member since the end of the First World War. It was a village sports club, and he was one of their key players. But Hitler said Jews were inferior physically, so there was no way they could be successful on a sports team. And so Jews were to be kicked out of any sports teams of which they were members. And so my father was told he would have to leave the sports club of which he had been, a member for many years, and that he was not welcome to play. Now, nobody on that club stood up and said, "This is ridiculous. No, this makes no sense at all." Their attitude was, "Well, this is the law. We have to obey the law. This is one of the big things that Germans learned as little kids is you obey somebody who is more important than you. We have to obey the law, and people will see how foolish it is, and it will get changed. But we won't say anything. So these people in the sports club were all bystanders. They were willing to let it happen. Not a single person was an upstander and said no. And so my father had to leave. And that winter, he also had to leave the bowling club because, again, he was Jewish, and that was not good for the club. In the spring of 1934, the Glee Club, the Village Glee Club, gave a concert. My father was one of their tenors. He had been a member for quite a long time. He had already done this in high school. And at the end of that concert, the conductor said, okay, everybody will stand up and we'll sing the national anthem and give them a salute. And my father knew what this meant and knew what it was stood for. And because he had a lot of self-respect, he didn't stand up. And somebody later told me that he was chased out of that room as if he were a rabid dog. Again, all of them were bystanders. They were all, they thought this was the right thing to do. They were all being good German citizens. And so my family became very isolated in this village. It was, going from extremely popular and integrated into all kinds of activities, they suddenly found themselves isolated over the next couple of years. We were outside, people would cross the street so they wouldn't have to talk to us. I was told to get off the sidewalk. I was polluting it because I was a dirty Jew. All these friends I had who came to my house to play suddenly didn't come anymore. Their parents were afraid that if they were associated with somebody who was Jewish, they would get into trouble. And so more and more, we became more and more isolated. And I learned not even to play outside on the street, but to stay in the house. My best friend became my mother because I didn't have other friends to play with, except one little girl did. She did maintain a contact with me, but that was all. So it became a very lonely and difficult time. And we just could hope that it would get better. In 1935, the Nazis issued a whole series of laws called the Nuremberg Laws. I don't know have you studied those or looked at those? Yes? Okay. So you know that one of the things that the Nuremberg Laws did was say that Jews were no longer citizens of Germany. So we also lost the protection of the law in the process. And we're even more isolated than before. By the end of 1935, the Nazis had declared a boycott of German stores. And that went in two directions. First of all, it meant that people could not buy in a store that was owned by a Jew. So it was my father who had a store that supported two sets of families, my own family and my grandparents who continued to live in the house. And suddenly he lost his customer base. His business went down to 10% of what it had been originally. And we were even more isolated because even this commercial exchange no longer took place. The only person in the village who spoke out against this, the only one who stood up to it, was the Catholic priest who would give a sermon every Sunday saying, support this family, don't let them be isolated, help them, give them food, buy stuff, go at night. If you have to, and go in the back door, but do support them. People were afraid to come in the front door because the Nazis had stationed Gestapo on either side of the block, and they would keep track of anybody who came into the store. And so the next day, that family would get a knock on the door. The Gestapo would be there. It was pretty scary. And they would be told, we know what you did. You went and bought from this Jew store. If you're going to do that again, your family will be in trouble. So there was a set of really negative things going on that really scared the population. And they were completely bombarded with propaganda of all kinds on loudspeakers. The Nazis actually put loudspeakers on telephone poles so that they could blast out anti-Semitic screeds and they could blast out pro-Hitler things. So they were surrounded. Everybody was surrounded by this feeling of Nazis are great. The Jews are terrible. They're destroying our country. We got to get rid of Germany at that point had a policy of making the country Judenrein, which means clean of Jews. So Jews were considered something dirty. They were vermin, um, cockroaches, whatever, and they definitely wanted to get rid of them. Well, at this point, my parents really decided that it was not a good idea to stay in Germany, that to raise a child in those conditions was really not very helpful. And so they started looking around about the place of refuge, and it was very difficult. England was accepting only children, and my parents didn't want to have us split up. Palestine, now Israel, was closed to emigration. It would have been a natural place for Jews to go, but the British had closed all the ports and didn't allow anybody in. And the United States had a quota system and was very anti-Semitic. The quota system was for some, I don't know, it was 3,000-4,000 a year who would be able to come in. You had to apply for a visa and go through a long process of being vetted to make sure that you were acceptable, and that there would be somebody in the United States who would look after you so you wouldn't end up on welfare. So the State Department actually issued orders to the consulates that they should make entrance for Jews as difficult as possible and slow up the process as much as possible. When my parents applied for a visa, they got together all of the documents, and it's a slow process because all the mail went by sea. So you had like 2 weeks for a boat to go in one direction and another 2 weeks for it to go in the other direction, and all the time in between. So it was a long-term process. They finally got everything together, sent it into the consulate, and then never got any acknowledgement from them that they had received it. My father finally was able to get through to them and ask what had happened. And they told him, well, we've lost your documents. You'll have to start all over again. So, this was the U.S. making this as hard as possible. And so we had to start all over again. And it was getting more and more difficult. And I can imagine the kind of tensions that my parents were experiencing during that time. They were very careful to shield me as much as possible. Well, by 1936, Hitler also had decreed that Jewish children could not attend public schools. The exception was if there was only one Jewish child in a class. That child could attend, but would have to sit at the back of the room and not be participating in any way. So, not answer questions, not hand in homework, not get graded, not get promoted. Don't go out into the playground when there are Aryan children out there. Just sit and be isolated. My parents really didn't want that to happen to me. So in 1937, when I was old enough to go to school, they kept me home. But by 1938, they said, I've got to get some kind of formal education. And the alternative was to send me to the city where my grandparents lived, to Freiburg, and to enroll me in a Jewish school. Now, this is a big public school. Looks pretty much like public schools do anywhere. And it's still in operation. And in 1938, when I went there, there was a basement door in the back of the building. And we would go into that door and down into the basement where there were 2 rooms set aside as classrooms. Those rooms are still there. I saw them not that long ago. There we had, there was grades 1 through 3 in one room, 4 through 6 in the other. And there we went to school. And my grandmother would walk me to school. And as soon as school was over, she would be there and walk me back. So it was not a time when we could be integrated with other children very well. And I actually don't even remember most of the children who were in that class with me. But I went to school there, and I was there in November of 1938. How many of you have you learned about Kristallnacht? Yeah, I see a lot of nodding heads and raised hands. Okay. I was living with my grandparents because I was going to school here when that happened. And you know that on Kristallnacht, all the synagogues in Germany were attacked, and most of them were burned. This is the synagogue that I went to in Freiburg. It was in the center of town, right across the street from the university on one side and the opera house on the other side. It was very prominent. This is what it looked like after Kristallnacht. And I remember walking past it a week or so later and seeing the smoke and the burning embers still coming from that building. I wasn't home in the village in Kensington, but I heard what happened. During the day, the Nazis mobilized all the school children, from the littlest kids to the teenagers in the high school. And they had them marching in the streets. They gave them Nazi flags. The Hitler Youth young men were all in their uniforms. The teachers all wore their armband with a swastika on it. The villagers hung out the flags that got, that blood red, black and white flag with a swastika. And the kids walked up and down the street singing nationalistic songs and singing anti-Semitic songs, which they had learned in school. And the loudspeakers from the telephone poles all blared the music out. So there's a lot of spirit, a lot of noise, a lot of activity. And the tension in the village must have just kept going up and up. And my parents and my grandparents could do absolutely nothing. That nobody went to say, you come to our place and be safe. They were isolated in their home. They locked the doors. They closed the shutters in the hope that people would just forget that they were there. But that night, a group of 5 or 6 men came into the village. They had been very, very well briefed exactly what to do. They went straight to my father. His store was the only Jewish-owned store in the village. They went to the store. They tore down the shutters. They opened the doors. They went into the store and they ransacked the store. They kept some of it, and most of it they just piled up. Whatever was left in the store couldn't have been very much, but they piled it all up in the street. And then they went up to the 3rd floor where my parents lived, so they knew exactly what they were doing. And they broke down that door, and I just can't imagine how terrified my parents must have been at that point. But they stormed into the apartment, and they took all of my parents' books and all of my mother's sheet music, and they threw it out the window. And they put it in a big pile, and they set the pile on fire. My mother never played the piano again after that night. The next morning, an open truck came into the village and collected all of the Jewish men who were age 60 and over. So it was my father, my grandfather, and there was one other family who was still living, Jewish family who was still living in the village. So they collected the men from that family. They went from village to village until the truck was full. It was all open in daylight. It was a sunny day. Everybody could see what was happening. Nobody reacted. When the truck was full, they went to the railroad station. They put the men on trains and they sent them to Dachau. Dachau was the first concentration camp that Hitler had ever built. He built it as soon as he became chancellor, and it was designed to house prisoners who were somehow in Hitler's eyes, anti-Hitler. So it was already full of political prisoners. There were some homosexuals in it. There were some Seventh-day Adventists in it. And all of a sudden, on November 8th, thousands of Jewish men were poured into that camp as well. The conditions were horrible because there was no room, so everybody had a triple and quadruple in the bunks. Food, which was always minimal, was even scarcer. There was no sanitation, there was no medicine, and the situation was ripe for epidemics of all kinds. The Nazis recognized that if that happened, they might get some of the illness as well. And so they said almost right away, after a couple of days, that anybody who was age 60 and over would be released from the camp. And so my 2 grandfathers, who were both in this camp, were released within a week of being there. And finally, they also said that anybody who was proving that they were going to leave Germany to help make Germany use the Rhine would be able to leave as well. And so my mother went to the Gestapo in the village, and she showed them copies of our exit the applications to exit. And on the basis of that, my father came home after about 5 weeks. He came home with no hair. He was completely shaved off. He had I just could visualize his traumatic expression that he had on his face after having been there for 5 weeks. And he brought with him this yellow star, and I still have it. It was the first. Dachau was the first place where the Nazis experimented with using a yellow star to identify Jews. They had used green triangles for political prisoners and big ones for homosexuals, yellow triangles for Seventh-day Adventists, but they tried to see what would happen if they could use the yellow star, and that has really become a symbol of the Holocaust. This is one of the very first ones that was issued. I can show it to you later. On the basis of this, you can imagine that my parents were more eager than ever to get out of Germany, and they kept trying to get in touch with the American embassy. But there was a problem because the Nazis had said Jews are not citizens. So how are you going to get a passport if you're not a citizen? And so in a way we were stuck. But they finally figured out that if they could issue identification cards, and with an identification card you could then apply for a passport. So this is my father's identification card, the big J on the left, to make sure everybody knew this was a Jew. The signature includes the middle name Israel. The Nazis said Jews were not human beings, so they don't need individual names. We don't name cockroaches, or unless they're unusual pets. So all Jewish men should just be called Israel, and all Jewish women should just be called Sarah. So every time you signed your name, you had to include that as your middle name. The photographer was told to use a kind of a backlight and a three-quarter view because that made the nose look big. And all of propaganda that the Nazis had about Jews was saying that Jews had big noses. That was one of the ways you could tell who they were. So this was my father's ID, and this was my mother's. And you can see her middle name is Sarah. She had that haunted look on her face of someone who has been persecuted. This is mine, and I remember having that picture taken because I had been told when you were in front of a photographer, you smile, and I suspect most of you have been told the same thing. So I did, and the photographer got very angry. He told me I was a dirty Jew and I had nothing to smile about, and to wipe the smile off my face. And, I was about 6 years old at the time, 7, 8, almost 8. So I did, but with these ID cards, we were finally able to get passports. The Germans said, well, we'll give you the passport as soon as we get the visa from the American embassy. And the American embassy finally in May said, we have a visa for you, which was pretty amazing. But we'll need to have your passport in order to put it in. So again, we were stuck. And finally, the U.S. said, okay, we'll issue a temporary visa, and we'll put the word in once you get a passport. And so we did. We applied for the passports, and we did get them, and we went to the consulate and got our visa stamped in the passport. We were also told, and we had to, in order to get the visa, we had to have proof that we had passage out of Germany. And so we were able to find a ship that left Germany on August 15th of 1939 out of Hamburg, and we made arrangements to get tickets for one cabin economy class in that boat. And so we finally got our passports and a letter saying that in order to leave, the only thing we could leave, we could have one suitcase, one steamer truck for the 3 of us to put our clothes in. And since it was summer, we had only summer clothes in there. And whatever papers and items we wanted to take, but no jewelry. The only jewelry, nothing of value. So the only items we could take was married couples could each wear a gold wedding band, and adults age 16 and over could have a watch. Other than that, the only items we could take were personal items plus the equivalent of $5 per person. And so when we left on August 15th on the boat, we had $15 with office and summer clothes and lots of paper documents that my parents thought would be helpful. The boat took 13 days to get across the Atlantic. We arrived August 28th because it went zigzagging so to avoid submarines. And we arrived in New York on August 28th, 1939. When did the Second World War fighting begin? Anybody know? Yeah? Perfect. September 1st. So we got there 3 days before the war began. Our ship was the last passenger line to leave Germany on schedule. Others left later, and they were delayed, but we were on time. And so I think I'm extremely lucky that I was able to get out when I did, and that I was able to rebuild a life here in the United States. I'm going to leave it at that. I want you particularly to notice in the story, though, that the gradual steps with which all of these things happen. It wasn't all at once all men were arrested. It wasn't that all at once all Jews were put into concentration camps. It was a gradual process. And by the time we got to 1938, most of the people in the village had gotten used to not even seeing Jews, not even recognizing that there were any around or that were in their village or in their city. And so when they were arrested and when they were deported, you hardly noticed them. They were gone, that's all. And who knows what happened. Makes it a lot easier. So, think about that as you think about some of the reasons that Hitler was successful.